This is the podcast of the NOVA Center on Business, Human Rights and the Environment. Welcome.
Welcome to this new podcast episode of the NOVA BHRE new series on perspectives on the Omnibus Proposal. My name is Claire Bright and I am the founder and director of the NOVA Center on Business, Human Rights and the Environment. And today I have the pleasure to have with me Kristel Tonstad, who is Policy Director at the Norwegian National Contact Point for Responsible Business Conduct. Hello, Kristel. And Daniel Schönfelder, who is a legal advisor at the Responsible Contracting Project and expert on business and human rights. Hello, Daniel. So thank you both. Thank you both for being here today. So today's session or episode will focus on the experience from both the German and the Norwegian mandatory human rights due diligence laws. And so the lessons that can be learned from this experience from a sort of policymaking perspective. So I'll start with you, Daniel, if that's all right. The German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, or LKSJ, has been adopted in June 2021. It's been in place for quite a few years now. And there are a number of studies that show that it has triggered significant shift in corporate behaviour. So I would like to ask you if you could maybe share some of the key elements from the experience of the German law and the sort of responses from companies to the German law.
So the German law has had a lot of positive impacts, I would say. Firstly, it's quite clearly structured with clear obligations. Also, talking to you as a French business human rights expert, you might say that we, to some degree, learned from the French mistakes, although I don't want to take the credit away from France being a real pioneer with the duty of vigilance law, making it more clear in the obligations, and that makes it easier for companies to implement. Companies do implement the law, and with meaningful measures, I would say. A lot of companies recruited experts on human rights and built cross-functional implementation teams, start to take measures. There's a lot of studies out there that show that they really invest in human rights due diligence. You can also see rights holders starting to benefit, and also in places where you wouldn't expect so. For example, on the German Autobahn. Yeah, Germans love their Autobahn. But there's a lot of exploitation happening at the German Autobahn, especially in the logistics sector. You can see truck drivers being exploited, being carried from other countries, bound by recruitment fees, working in conditions in which at least some forced labor indicators appear. And so these people now use the law to fight for their rights, in some cases already successfully. Stolen wages, payback of recruitment fees, and so on. They can really make use of it. And you see similar things happening in other contexts like China. It's a very interesting study by the China Labor Bulletin that shows in detail how in China, the German Supply Chain Act is being used to fight exploitation of workers. So in this context, you see in my work, countries worldwide starting to care, not only companies, but also states and business associations. I've been working with actors from Vietnam, Colombia, India, Denmark, and you can see that they say, okay, Europe, Germany, and France, and Norway are taking it more serious, the topic of sustainability and of human rights. Maybe it's worth investing also in sustainability to be more competitive, not by being cheap, but by being responsible. So these are really great impacts by the law that I see, which you can also see in new initiatives for new laws around the globe in South Korea, Colombia, Brazil, Thailand. And the German state has acted smartly on this, I would say. The BAFA took a good approach of enforcement, saying, okay, this is a complex topic. This is a learning curve for all of us. So we will implement dialogue-based. not enforcing very hard from the start, but saying, okay, we will require you companies to take meaningful measures, but we understand that this is something you still have to learn step by step. And they support the companies with open access tools like the CSR risk check, like the BHR navigator, really good things, practical tools that help companies implement this. So that's like from the positive side.
And that's very helpful. Thank you, Danielle, because also the German government has been extremely active in putting together guidelines that have been also very helpful to complement these tools that you were mentioning for companies. I was also wondering if you could share some of the sort of critical challenges that the LKSJ's experience has highlighted, and maybe the lessons learned from that experience for policymakers across the globe that they should be aware about when they are drafting mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. And also eager to hear what Kristel has to say about that, because I just made a small study around this, analyzing German practice and also having the pleasures to analyze some Norwegian experiences, which are extremely interesting. But yeah, from the German side, there is several things that we can learn. I like to say that others should learn from our mistakes and build on our successes. From Germany, because there's both. I already mentioned the successes. So let's focus on some of the things that could be better. And I think there's three I would like to point out. The first is around the issue of tier 1 and tier N, so direct and indirect suppliers, and covering them in the HREDD processes. We have seen that in Germany, we have a rule that says, okay, you have to focus mostly on the first tier of your supply chain, and only exceptionally look at the tier N suppliers. Namely, if you have substantiated knowledge of risks or violations. If you take an example from my hometown, I live in Hamburg, where a lot of products are imported, it becomes clear that this might not be such a good idea. So the main coffee exporters of Germany sit in Hamburg. And if you take from a German supermarket's perspective, the tier 1 perspective, and you look at the office of your importer of coffee in Hamburg, yeah, you might find some risk. You might find that women and men still not receive the same pay for equal work, or you find some discrimination of BIPOC groups. But the real risks lie deeper in the supply chain, where there might be child labor happening, where farmers don't get a living income. So where should you focus your limited resources as a company? In my view, you should focus them where you can create most impacts for human rights, which would be deeper in the supply chain. The problem with the German Act is it really incentivized companies to look at the direct suppliers. And they did so in a way that was often, not always, quite bureaucratic. They said, okay, well, we have to look at all of our direct suppliers, which was never true, but they assumed that that was the case. And they sent them all questionnaires, one-size-fits-all questionnaires, that sent out boilerplate questions like, do you respect the prohibition of child labor? And this didn't really give them meaningful insights, but it still produced a lot of paperwork. So this is why some firms in Germany got the impression that this was a bureaucracy monster, which is not true at all. So that's like the biggest thing I would say from Germany. You shouldn't repeat this mistake by creating a law that incentivizes to look primarily on the first tier of your supply chain, but rather take the risk-based approach, which we've seen in Norway. Two smaller things, well, I mean, smaller, they're also important. One is the weakness of the climate protection requirements in the German law. So you don't have a clear protection of the climate included in the human rights and environmental due diligence process, which is very problematic. We all know that climate is a huge challenge. In the German law, we have protection for air pollution. So you could have a long legal debate if air pollution is also emissions of carbon dioxide. or not. And there's good arguments for both sides, but it's not clear. And the last one is civil liability. We have a very, very unclear regulation around civil liability, where you can really look at the law and say, I'm not sure if there's civil liability or not. Again, if you want to be really confused, just read section 3, subsection 3, and section 11, the German Supply Chain Act, and then section 823 of the German Civil Code. So these are things that others should do better than Germany. Get clear rules on this.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And moving on to Norway now with you, Kristel. So the 2 recent studies that have demonstrated that the Norwegian Transparency Act has had positive impact on corporate practices. And I wonder, Kristel, if you could share a bit more of that Norwegian experience with us.
Yes, thank you. I think, as Daniel was also alluding to, is that we have very clear evidence from Norway now that risk-based due diligence can be regulated. You mentioned these studies, and they give very clear evidence that it works. Around 9,000 companies are covered by a law that requires human rights due diligence that is aligned with the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines, showing that it really is possible to regulate risk-based due diligence. These are not new standards. They are principles that governments and other stakeholders already stand by. And this approach of building very strongly on international standards has been supported by the business community and also by other stakeholders. And we now have very, very positive experiences and outcomes so far. Companies are reporting that the law is working well. One of the studies that was recently launched, I think it was in December last year, looked at 600 companies, and most of them reported that the law is clear and manageable. They say that they have the capacity and the competencies needed to meet the requirements in the law. And this also includes smaller and medium-sized enterprises. The law has been enforced now for about 3 years, and we're starting also to see some trends and some results in terms of responsible recruitment, calculations and implementation of living wages, investigations of early warnings and grievances, mediations with indigenous peoples, also ending projects with adverse impacts, such as the return of land to affected parties. Companies are reporting that this is giving them better insight into their supply chains. And it's really been experienced as an asset for many companies to have this type of regulation. It's motivating for the company as such. It also gives a stronger foundation for carrying out due diligence in line with international standards. As we know, the international standards have been there for almost 15 years, but many have struggled to find the resources and the commitment also from the top to really set aside resources to work on human rights issues in supply chains and beyond. And so this has been a very important motivator. And it's something that contributes to leveling the playing field within the business community. In terms of other positive impacts, we've also seen that there are some very good synergies between, or there's some positive outcomes when supervisory authorities work with existing mechanisms. We've seen that the Norwegian Consumer Authority has worked well with other stakeholders, also worked well with us in the Norwegian National Contact Point for responsible business conduct. And we've seen that supervision is important, but that it's also been very important to have engagement from other stakeholders to ensure the success of the law. So the regulation in itself is necessary, but it's not sufficient to realize the goal of ensuring corporate respect for human rights. But if I were to just summarize a key experience from the Norwegian Transparency Act, is that it really works to have a law that requires risk-based human rights due diligence. It allows companies to prioritize their most significant risks, which are very often not found in tier 1 of the supply chain.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Kristel. And I'd like to ask you the same question as I asked Daniel earlier about the sort of critical challenges that the Norwegian experience has highlighted. And again, the lessons that can be learned from that experience for policymakers across the globe.
So it's always a balance to find it's a challenge perhaps to find the right balance between allowing room for interpretation and also having necessary legal clarity. I think we've found a good balance in terms of the definitions in the law, but there are still some terms that have been perhaps not clearly enough defined. And that can be filled by having good guidance, essentially. We've also seen some bureaucracy, and there again, in terms of companies sending out forms and questionnaires to suppliers, and there again, it's important to have guidance to remind companies of the purpose of the law and of not sort of having a one-size-fits-all approach. The risks will be different. The methods of working on those risks will also be different from sector to sector. And so guidance has been very important in communicating what the purpose of the law is, and that it's not necessarily realized through a vast amount of desk research or questionnaires that overwhelm suppliers at times. One of the challenges that we've seen has been that there has been a limited understanding, perhaps, of remediation. So the law requires companies to provide for cooperate in remediation where they have caused or contributed to adverse impacts. That's still an area where there are challenges in terms of understanding and practices. And again, an important area for guidance and discussions moving forward. I think, again, it's important to remember that the supervisory authorities will not solve everything. We also need the dialogue and engagement of different stakeholders coming together, discussing what the challenges are and how to meet them best.
Thank you so much, Kristel. So I have a question which I'd like to address to both of you, and maybe we can start with Daniel and hear from Kristel as well. So you have both mentioned the sort of positive impacts, but also the challenges of the experiences of Germany and Norway with these laws. And I was wondering if the lessons learned from these experiences have been, in your opinion, incorporated in this CSDDD. And I'm talking here about the version that was adopted last year on the 13th of June 2024, leaving aside for now the omnibus discussions.
So yes, totally. I think the CSDDD of last year really, I was really happy seeing that, because it basically took all the good parts from the German Act and then weeded out the bad parts. So we had a good model of, and we still have, but a good model of the role of the authority, which will take a risk-based approach to controlling the firms. That's very good, well based on the positive German experience. The CSDDD threw out the wrongly built model of focusing on tier 1 and said, like the Norwegians did, tier N risk-based approach, and like the UNGP and the OECD said. No, so this was very positive for us in Germany. For anyone who cares about non-bureaucratic and effective human rights due diligence, this was very good news. The inclusion of climate was crucial because, of course, responsible companies act on climate. Which responsible company will not act on climate? So why should we not have a level playing field for this? Why should we ignore that? So the CSDDD corrected that mistake. Civil liability, clear rules, unitary rules for all of us, which would provide legal certainty, or at least a decent degree of legal certainty to victims and businesses, both unitary standard that would apply no matter where the harm occurs. And other important points, also alluding to points that Kristel was mentioning, like streamlining things like standards of stakeholder engagement or remediation in line with responsible business standards. All this was very positive. Yeah, but then came the omnibus, but we will talk about that later.
Thank you, Daniel. And can I pass the floor to Kristel as well?
Yeah, I would agree with Daniel wholeheartedly. The original rendition of the directive of CSDDD had very many positive elements. some of which are also missing from the Norwegian Transparency Act, specifically clauses on civil liability and on climate transition plans. And these are also very important elements of CSDDD that can help companies to realize the goal of essentially responsible business conduct. So original CSDDD was a real win. And it's very unfortunate to see it sort of backtracking now. I think one lesson I would say from Norway that has not been incorporated, and of course Norway is not a member of the EU, and so we're not expecting the lessons from Norway necessarily to be incorporated. But I think one key issue that has been interesting to watch has been discussions around the threshold of this type of legislation. So in Norway, we started with a draft law that in the initial discussions, it was actually about saying that all companies should be required to carry out human rights due diligence, and that stakeholders should have a right to information on how adverse impacts are addressed. Because that is the starting point for international standards, right? That all companies can have human rights risks. And of course, what is expected of you will be proportionate and it's risk-based. But the sort of discourse around saying that this is too difficult for small and medium-sized enterprises, that they cannot do due diligence and they cannot possibly sort of have the resources needed to meet these standards, that is quite simply incorrect. Because in that sense, in moving in that direction, we are forgetting that governments have already committed to and already expect companies of all sizes to carry out risk-based human rights due diligence. So I think a key thing here is that the threshold has been set too high from the start, and that it's also now being set, in the discussions that are ongoing, even higher. And it's interesting to try to understand, where does this discourse come from, and why aren't governments sort of speaking out more loudly and saying that, well, these are standards that we've already committed to, and the regulation is only one part of the smart mix of realizing the goal of corporate respect for human rights.
Yeah, that's very helpful to remind that, Kristel. Thank you very much. And I would just add to what both of you were saying about the sort of incorporating the lessons learned from comparative experiences in the CSDDD. Certainly from the French perspective, we have seen that the French duty of vigilance law has had trickle-down effect on a much wider number of companies than the ones in scope, right? Through the larger companies in scope, then requiring their supplier to put in place certain due diligence requirements. But there are also studies that showed that in France, 90% of these SMEs that were asked by larger companies in scope to put in place certain due diligence measures were not accompanied in any way in doing that, either financially or otherwise, through capacity building or training. And the CSDDD does address that to a large extent by including very specific provisions to protect SMEs. And I think that's also very important, extremely positive development of the CSDDD as adopted last year. I see that Daniel wanted to add something, so I'll pass the floor back to Daniel.
Yeah, I love this topic I love engaging with Kristel on these things because I always learn so much. And I think the Norwegian experience is so rich. I mean, we also have to remember in the debate now, with the Omnibus, this regulation is supposed to be evidence-based, and how can we just ignore the evidence from Norway? I mean, that's like brutally arrogant. But the question of SMEs is so interesting because I think we really need to go in to the Norwegian experience and study how SMEs have been implementing this, because I think it could be very valuable to identify to what degree can we expect SMEs to implement these measures, and to what degree do we have to respect their limited capacity, which of course is important. I mean, I tend on this debate with the SMEs, but I'm very open to learning more, still to say, okay, I think it's better not to oblige them directly and then do the European German model, also based on the French and the German experience, like, oh, the SMEs were overwhelmed, and now we have to build a good standard that integrates them, but reasonably without overwhelming them. But maybe I'm wrong with this. No, maybe it's more honest and more straightforward to say, okay, well, everyone is obliged, but we build a standard that is really based on size and circumstances and expects less from SMEs. So yeah, great to be having this conversation, and very much looking forward to looking more in depth on that.
And it's certainly in line with the, as Kristel was reminding us, the international standards expectations, right, that indeed cover all companies, but with a proportionality built in. Kristel, did you also want to add something on this?
Yeah, I would just add that, yes, there is a threshold in the Norwegian law, so it doesn't extend in its current form to the very smallest companies. I think the threshold is around it's 50 full-time employees and a certain 70 million kroner turnover. So there is a threshold there, but then very important, as Claire was mentioning, is precisely the risk-based approach and proportionality. That does give companies the freedom and indeed the incentive to prioritize their most significant risks. And we know that having risks is not contingent on size. Risks can be whatever the size of the company, and making sure that we have a sort of uniform and level playing field is very important for business. I think, in the current debates around simplification, it's quite misleading, because I think experience shows that introducing new terms actually leaves more questions and creates new questions. Companies have had enough work to understand human rights due diligence based on international standards. So changing key terminology is actually not helpful, because those international standards will still be there. So having new definitions just means that we'll have legal departments struggling and grappling to understand, well, where do we draw the line here? Where they've already, perhaps, at least in some companies, been working to make sure that they are in line with international standards, which requires risk-based due diligence.
Thank you very much. And so both of you have already addressed to a large extent the Omnibus proposal, and kind of showed that it's not taking into consideration these lessons learned from these comparative experiences, and in particular the sort of critical challenges that were identified. So maybe to finish this podcast, I'd like to give each of you the floor to maybe share what are your main recommendations based on these experiences from Norway and Germany for the Omnibus discussions that are currently taking place. And maybe I will start with you, Kristel, this time.
Thank you. So I think a key recommendation would be that, as I said to start with, is that requiring risk-based human rights due diligence is possible. I think moving forward, it's very important to avoid creating new terms. That only makes it more complicated for companies to interpret, and will also get a sort of a greater difference or distance between international standards and regulations. And that's not really in the interest of the business community. When it comes to implementation, we need resources for guidance. That's perhaps something that we haven't had enough of in Norway, and where Germany has really been leading in terms of setting aside sufficient resources for guidance to companies. I think it's also really important to remember that we need to create discussion fora. Many issues cannot be solved by companies alone. So creating rooms where companies, spaces where companies can engage with other stakeholders is beneficial to all. We've really seen that in Norway, where the Norwegian Consumer Authority has worked together with us in the National Contact Point. We've carried out a number of trainings and workshops. And what companies appreciate most is the having this forum where they can discuss openly challenges, share experiences, and learn from each other, and also from other stakeholders that come in. One other thing I think we need to remember when thinking not just about the EU and Norway, and other companies here, other countries in our vicinity, is to remember to have also sort of a dose of humility, and to remember that we're talking about issues that are also regulated not only to some extent in our own countries, but also in other countries. So we need to remember, again, what the purpose of this type of regulation is, and really keep rights holders key in mind when drafting this type of regulation, making sure that it fills the gaps that are not already filled by other regulations. Moving forward, I think we also need some more work on how to assess due diligence. Having somewhat limited resources in the Norwegian context for supervision also means that we've not really come to the stage where we've looked at or where companies' due diligence has been assessed, and that will be important, looking at the quality of due diligence, something we do in cases or in specific instances in national contact points. But that's also an important issue to focus on moving forward. And finally, I would just say that the ecosystem around the law is very important for its success. Having supervision, yes, but also having discussions and engagement of various stakeholders with the business community and working together on realizing these important goals.
Thank you very much, Kristel. Daniel?
Thank you. Yeah, agree with all of Kristel's point. Very, very important points. I would add, I mean, the thing is that with the omnibus, the debate to some degree is driven by a legitimate concern, no, by businesses. So there's many ESG regulation standards in the EU, and to some degree they overlap. And to some degree, you can say that in the detail, it's not clear how they interact, although you can find solutions on that. The problem is that the omnibus response to this was not simplification or streamlining, but deregulation. So it's like a process driven by legitimate concern, then captured by interest that wanted to abolish this agenda altogether. That's a real problem, because it doesn't really give businesses a solution that they need. And I think from Scandinavia, the impressions that I get working with also firms from Denmark, and also echoing, listening to Kristel, I think sometimes they really understand that the business of business is not just business, that business is a complex actor in a complex society. And for business to thrive continuously, they need to take into account social factors, ecological factors, and they also need to be legitimate actors. And the CSDDD and all this regulation is supposed to be a tool to kind of concretize, formalize this abstract notion, and give companies and society procedures in which this legitimacy and this responsibility can be exercised. Currently, unfortunately, the omnibus procedures undermine this important mission. And the most important lessons learned from the German experience and the Norwegian experience would be, for me, first, take evidence-based regulation seriously. Yeah, don't ignore these experiences, especially from the Norwegian side, where we see that businesses say, okay, tier N risk-based due diligence is actually something meaningful. It's something helpful. Why do we instead build a model based on bureaucracy? It doesn't really make sense. Why do we want to recreate the chaos of uncertainty around civil liability? Why do we want to convert climate obligations basically in New Year's promises, where now companies under the current proposal would be obliged to make a plan, but then not to enact the plan? Like the New Year's promise of saying, okay, I will go jogging every Sunday. It's basically the same thing now. So I think that instead of this, we should really focus on streamlining, explain how the CSDDD interacts with other regulations. Yeah, seeing the CSDDD kind of as a basic module, sustainability, ESG regulation, and the other ones, CSRD, EUDR, batteries, EU FLR, like modules that modify in certain ways and add things. and give more practical guidance on tough problems like tier N prioritization, adequacy as obligations, as an expression of obligations of means, create more open public knowledge goods, guidance, living wage data, make the CSR risk check more user-friendly, build practical templates, make life easier for businesses, but don't undermine the necessary standards that give them give the responsibility that everyone knows they have for.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And maybe a last word to Kristel before we close that podcast.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Daniel is saying, that CSDDD is really the heart of this type of regulation. Some of the issues, in terms of reporting, that has been overwhelming to some companies. But I would just highlight that CSDDD is the most important piece of the puzzle, and that is not the regulation that we want to see going away, because that is the building block for other regulations, but it's also the very heart of what companies' responsibilities actually are according to international standards. So let's stick to CSDDD and its as far as possible, and then have more discussions around how to make sure that the whole picture is working well together to realize the ambition.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much to both of you for taking the time to be here today with us and sharing your extremely valuable insights from your practical experiences with these laws. That brings us to the end of this new podcast episode on the perspectives on the Omnibus proposal. And I look forward to continuing this discussion. Thank you both again so much, and stay tuned for our next episodes. Bye-bye.